Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Scrum at Scale overview webinar. This is an express webinar, and I'm going to hand us over to Steve Martin, the presenter. Steve, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm excited over the next 25 minutes or so to talk about the Scrum at Scale model in this express webinar. I'm going to try to give you some of the key things you need to know about the Scrum at Scale approach. A little bit about me before we get in there. I've been working in and around technology for around 30 years, starting off as a programmer for about 10 years, then into management and project management and a little bit of product management, and then just management in general. And then the last 10, 12 years or so, I've been helping organizations in finance, computers, manufacturing, healthcare, and some others make the transition to using agilistic approaches for their particular organization. Now, when it comes to taking a look at scaling, there's some really interesting things that have happened out there. I've had the pleasure to co-train several times with Jeff over the last couple of years, and there was something that he said that really struck me as interesting, and that when he and Ken were creating Scrum, Scrum was really intended for teams. And even if you look in the Scrum guide, what you see there is it's a framework that consists of Scrum teams, you know, with their associated roles, events, artifacts, and rules. But they were really focusing in on making sure that a team was working well. And what I find is that when organizations start to scale things, what they try to do is just do more Scrum. And so what that looks like is a little bit of what you see on the screen here. Yay, we want to do some more Scrum, so let's just pile some more Scrum on top of what we're doing. And that tends to not work so well. They've created a bunch of additional bureaucracy on top of it, trying to make everything consistent with good intentions, but they just ended up throwing a lot more Scrum on top of Scrum. And didn't quite work out so well. And so Jeff kind of took a step back and said, all right, what do we need to really look at when we start thinking about scaling frameworks? And he's a huge fan of the systems thinking model, as am I. And when you read some of these quotes here, it's kind of intuitive. It's just like, yeah, no kidding. But there's certain things that we need to kind of make sure that we understand when we start talking about scaling. We're looking at organizations, because in order to get a product out the door, especially a complex or complicated one, we find that the organizations are really highly interconnected. And so when you start doing things differently, when you start getting products out the door in a different way, we really have to take that holistic view of that entire organization. And so you have to have that macro level view, because when you change one part of an organization, it's kind of like that pebble in the water. It's going to ripple out. It's going to cascade into other parts of the system. And so if we just look at one isolated area and we don't take a look at the big picture, more than often, I find that things don't go so well. And that's basically where the whole Scrum at Scale approach came into play, is we wanted to look at a network of teams. So we're going to be really focused on sets of teams, networks of teams, working together to address complex adaptive problems, you know, while we're trying to deliver products of the highest possible value. Now, the interesting thing here with the Scrum at Scale guide, and you can get this at the scrumatscale.com. So if you go to scrumatscale.com and then you can click on I believe it's the resources, you can download the Scrum at Scale guide. What you're going to find is that it's really focused in how do we get an organization to think differently. And that's the biggest difference with Scrum at Scale that I see comparing to some of the other scaling approaches that are out there. What we're trying to do here is look at the holistic organization and see how do we make the entire organization as a whole more effective, as opposed to really focusing on an individual's or a departmental efficiency. There's a lot of work that is done with Scrum at Scale that's worked based in Peter Senge's work. This is actually a really good book. I'm not a huge person that recommends a lot of reading, this is one that I would highly recommend. But his fifth discipline, or his fifth approach, is making sure that we look at an organization from that holistic viewpoint, because it's going to take all of us together working as an organization to get something out the door. So we need to be effective. And so when we start looking at the holistic version, what Jeff did is he said, all right, how can we put in a set of practices and approaches that can help organizations operate more effectively? And that's when he started to build off the Scrum model. So building off of the Scrum values, the Scrum principles, the things that are available to you from that framework, except applying it to a network or an organizational view. And that's where you end up with this Scrum at Scale framework. What you'll kind of see here on this relatively busy diagram is that you've got two circles. The circle on the left-hand side is the Scrum Master cycle. Those are the things that are going to help an organization with the how. How can we operate more effectively as an organization? The stuff that's in the red on the right-hand side is the product owner cycle, which is really focused in on the what. What can we do to make sure that we're delivering the highest value of a portfolio of products that are going to resonate with the market. So it's not just one particular product, but how's our portfolio looking and how are we competitive as an organization? And these are the two sides that we're going to kind of introduce today. Now, when you go through the full 2-day training with the Certified Scrum Scale Practitioner Workshop, we deep dive into each one of these areas here. And so today I'm just going to kind of give an overview of the highlights of the Scrum Master cycle and the highlights of the Product Owner cycle. But regardless of, where you want to begin, one of the biggest things that we want to look at here is actually the team level process. And you'll see that it's an intersection of both the Scrum Master cycle and the Product Owner cycle. It's up here at the top for a reason. Because what we want to make sure that we do is that we're actually have teams that are operating very well with some really solid foundational processes and practices. Because what we're going to find is that when we start scaling, the deficiencies that we have, not only within the team, but within the organization, are going to significantly magnify at a really uncomfortably fast exponential scale. So it's very difficult to build off of the Scrum but. We do Scrum but, and I just love this right here in the middle. That means no more planning, no more documentation, just start writing code and complaining. So if we don't address some of those things right away and have some relatively reasonable operating teams that are consistent with the Scrum Guide, it's going to make this really difficult. So what do I mean by some of those things? If you go to the Scrum Pattern Library, that's this link at the bottom, you're going to see a lot of patterns or practices that help folks be, better performing Scrum teams and just better performing teams. And so you're going to want to make sure that you've got, for example, small and stable teams, 3 to 9 people, co-location, or if you can't co-locate, having the video and other communication tools in place to make sure that you can approximate co-location, Scrumming the Scrum, which is doing the retrospectives, and all these other practices. When you have these things in place and you have a team that's performing, what that's going to enable you to do is create something called a reference model. And a reference model is something that's very specific to you, to your company, to where your maturity is today. And what you're going to find is that there's going to be a set of practices and approaches that work well for you. And there's going to be some, and I love this expression that they say in the South, oh, bless your heart. They're not going to work well for your organization. And you want to figure those things out with a small number of pilot teams so you can fix some of the issues not only within the team, but also fix some of the organizational blockers that might be in place that would prevent teams from moving faster when you start scaling. And you may need to do an assessment to identify where those gaps are across multiple teams and at the organizational level to kind of figure out where these are. But I usually do a phased approach when I do scaling. And I like to do 2 or 3 teams because I'd like to try a couple of these practices on this page here with one team, a couple of these other practices with another team, a couple practices with another team, and kind of figure out for that organization, hey, these are the things that work for us, and these are the things that don't. So again, I've got that reference model. Now, once we kind of figure out the practices, the cadence, the size of teams, working through backlogs, how we're going to do testing and all those types of things at the team level, with that reference model, I want to be careful that I just don't take that model and start to spread it across the rest of the organization like peanut butter, because I've made this mistake before. Hey, we got a reference model. It's going to work here, so it's going to work everywhere. No, not exactly. You want to make sure that you've got a framework that you can adjust moving forward, and use that as a reference and a place to begin as you start to expanding across the rest of the organization. So you're going to want to spend some time here with this reference model. Figure out what works for you and your company before you start scaling out there. Now, when you do start scaling, there's two different ways that we can take a look at some scaling. I'm going to first start with a Scrum Master cycle for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to transition over to the product owner cycle as our quote final unit for the day. So let's take a look at the Scrum Master cycle over here. Again, this is the how a organization operates. Now let's talk through an example here. Let's just say that we've got 5 teams. We've got team A, B, C, D, and E. All 5 of these teams are working together as a program to get a particular product out the door. It could be all software, it could be hardware, it could be a mixture of hardware and software. It doesn't really matter. What you have here is a set of 5 teams that need to be coordinated, need to be connected, especially when you start having things like dependencies, and when you start having blockers pop up in one team that may impact another team. And so from the Scrum at Scale perspective, the first thing that we're going to do here is create another team, which is called the Scrum of Scrums. Now, we're going to do just a little bit of terminology here because we're going to distinguish between a Scrum of Scrums, which is a team, it's a team of teams, versus the Scale Daily Scrum on the next side, which is the event or the place at which these Scrum of Scrums or this team gets together to discuss things. So the Scrum of Scrums is just basically a team of teams. And what I like to do is I like to take 2 people from each of these teams that are impacted. I typically take the Scrum Master, but it doesn't have to be the Scrum Master, and whoever's having the issue or whoever's having the problem. Or whoever's having the dependency on another team. So I might have a Scrum Master and someone who typically does coding from one team meet with a Scrum Master and somebody who might be in a product owner or another developer in another team. So I like to have a buddy system, kind of like that XP practice of pairing. You're going to go together to what's called the Scaled Daily Scrum, which mirrors the daily Scrum. It's a 15-minute meeting that happens with the 2 participants from each of these teams that they're going to basically think how they're going to replan the day in order to achieve the sprint goal for the set of teams at the end of the sprint. How's it going? What do we need to replan? Are there any impediments that are blocking us? Is there something that you learned from over here that we need to learn over there? So it's basically that group that's going to mirror that daily Scrum as you would for the teams. We're going to do that at the Scrum of Scrums level with a scaled daily Scrum. So the Scrum of Scrum is the teams, the Scale Daily Scrums is the actual event. Now, what happens if you've got even more complex product? Let's just say that you've got 2 programs together, 10 teams together that need to get a product out the door. Well, this is kind of where it gets that little ridiculous, where you can kind of chuckle to yourself and just kind of say, really? Seriously? Is this what we're going to call it? Well, there's something called a Scrum of Scrums. And so, they know this is ridiculous. You're going to have to call it and give this a meaning that's going to make sense for your organization. But what we're going to try to do here is that, all right, Team A, you might have a daily Scrum that has, all right, something that's going on for that particular team. Let's say that's at 10 o'clock in the morning. Then at 10:30, you might have a Scrum of Scrums get together in the Scale Daily Scrum, we're at 10:30, you take a look at this group over here, and then this group over here, they've got their Scrum of Scrums meeting also at 10:30. Well, what happens if there's a dependency between this group over here, number 1, and number 2? If you can't get it resolved, then perhaps at 11 o'clock, you would have the Scale Daily Scrum for the Scrum of Scrums here. And so what you see here is this kind of organic pattern of using teams and the concept of the daily scrum that you can apply at multiple different levels to kind of surface up issues and raise them up as appropriate. But here's the key to this in order to make this work. If you bring things up to this level, the folks that come from each one of these teams actually has to bring the information back to the teams in order to do those types of things. So you want to make sure that you have that two-way communication. Ultimately, let's just say you've got all these different programs. You've got program A, program B, C, D, and E here. So these are all programs. It's eventually going to roll into something that they call the executive action team. And the things that roll up to the executive action team is basically all those impediments that can't be handled at that team level, Scrum of Scrums level, or even the Scrum of Scrums level, and things like that. So if it needs to go up to that point to resolve it, we can do those types of things. The EAT is also responsible for the organizational strategy. So it's going to be that transformation backlog for the entire organization. So within that backlog, it's also going to have those impediments, and then just eat those impediments and make sure that the organization is set up for success. Now, typically these folks that are at the EAT, they're pretty high powered. You've got some folks that are basically at your C levels or your EVPs. It might be a representative from HR or legal compliance, somebody who can write a check. But I also want someone who really understands Scrum as part of that executive action team. But basically, you want these folks to be able to create that transformation backlog, remove impediments, and make sure that they can demonstrate the actions to ensure that the organization is being able to adopt Scrum and their practices. Now, these are some folks that typically have some other things on their plate to do. And so what they'll typically do, especially for larger companies, so if you've got, let's say, more than 200, 300, 400 employees as part of this, I start to see the executive action team delegate the responsibility to executing that backlog as part of what they call the Agile Practice. And so it's a cross-functional Scrum team. Typically, these are folks like managers. That are going to take that transformation backlog and really execute against that backlog and figure out how to make the organization at a tactical level work very well. That way it can let the EAT remain strategic. And so the Agile Practice is also going to doing some things like some coaching, center of continuous learning, and ultimately want to make sure that the quality of Scrum is happening well within the organization. So that's pretty much the Scrum Master cycle. It's how we kind of raise things up, how we get to a transformation backlog, and how we can kind of manage the work around ensuring that we've got an organization that's performing well. Now, let's take a look at the product owner cycle. Now, this is the what. This is the what we need to do as an organization. Now, I find that when many organizations start to do the transformation, you would think that many organizations would have this, but it's amazing how many folks don't actually have a strategic vision. It's hard to know as a company, as an organization, what your goals are, where the markets we're going to compete, what is our position, and what kind of guiding principles do we have. And so you want to make sure that this is present for your company before you start doing your transformation. Because you can do a whole lot of activity and you can be very busy, but if you don't have a direction, it's just going to be busy work. And so when you start taking a look at the product owner cycle, let's assume that you've got that vision, you've got that direction. Well, we know from a lot of our Scrum practices, and especially at the Scrum Guide level, we've got some pretty good ideas what the product owner does. They work with the team within the sprints. They're going to maximize the value of the backlog and do some validated learning. But what we're going to do here is, let's go back to our same teams, team A, B, C, D, E, and we've got a product owner. product owner A, product owner B, product owner C, D, and E, they're going to need to get together to make sure that their backlogs are coordinated. And that's going to happen through the assistance of what's called a chief product owner. Chief product owner is going to work across multiple teams, take a look at the roadmap, and make sure that the teams are coordinating what it is that they're working on over time. And again, this is where it gets a little ridiculous. Let's just say that you've got a set of teams and things like that. You can go to a chief product owner, of course. That's a ridiculous title. It's typically going to be a director of product management or a VP of product management. That's typically what you're going to be looking at. But this person is going to be really looking at the value streams, making sure we have a vision and having our organizational priorities getting together. And so if we were to just kind of go a little bit more into detail, the Meta Scrum is basically going to be that group of folks, typically the product owners led by the chief product owner. It's going to really take a look at, okay, here's the roadmap. Here is where we think the different teams can contribute to that particular roadmap, and we're going to refine at regular intervals as a group of coordinated product owners with a chief product owner at a regular interval. Here's what I like to do, here's what I recommend, is that let's say you're on a 2-week cadence and you've got your sprint planning on a Wednesday. Well, on the following Wednesday, which would be day 6 of your sprint, I want the Meta Scrum to get together and have them take a look at everything and make sure that each of the teams has what they need to do for the upcoming sprints. That's what I like to do here. And of course, just with the other example that we had, we want to make sure that as an organization, we've got the vision set, we've got a single prioritized backlog of products. We're not at the user story level of products, you know, definition done and things like that defined for the team. So if we were to take a look at an example, we've got a couple product owners here, and they've got their own backlogs. This could be one Meta Scrum here. This could be another Meta Scrum here, and then this could be another Meta Scrum here. And then the executive Meta Scrum, I can't find my little drawing icon, but I could just draw an icon between the director of the product and then the chief product owners here. This would be my executive Meta Scrum. And that's how you keep the what all coordinated together. So where do you go next with all this stuff? Well, you've got a bunch of different approaches that you can take a look at. What the Scrum Scale model does is it doesn't necessarily say you must start exactly here. They do recommend that you clean up and make sure that you've got some reasonable reference models to start with, but where you go from there is where your organization needs the most help. You can pick anywhere on this diagram and go from there. Now, from my recommendation, I'd probably suggest you want to have an executive action team, which may or may not lead to an Agile practice. And that's basically your transformation backlog. But where you go from there is really up to you. Now with that, Kate, I'm going to get ready to turn this over to you. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how folks can learn some more about the Scrum at Scale model.
Yep, thank you, Steve. So we have 2 classes coming up with Steve. We have a class in November in Nashville and one in December in Burbank. There's a 10% discount code. We'll be sending out a copy of the slides afterwards. So the webinar discount code is there, so you'll get 10% off one of those classes. Steve, I had a quick question for you, and that is, what are some of the main ahas that people have in class?
I think the main ahas in class is that part of the course, what we do is we create what's called a heat map on each one of these particular components to the model. And then you're going to come out with a visual radiator that says, hey, this is red, this is red, this is yellow, this is yellow, this is yellow, this is green, this is green, this is green. Let's start with the red stuff first. And so when you walk out of there, you kind of have an idea of where should we start first?
Okay. And there was another question that came up during that. So do we want to close out the the quick webinar and then answer questions for those that want to stay on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let's do that. So for the folks that want to stay on for Q&A, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I unfortunately can't see the chat window, so maybe Kate, you'll have to help me with that.
Yep.
And then for those that want to get on with their day, please feel free.
Yep, you'll get a survey pop up. So if you don't mind, give us some feedback on that. And then let's move on to some questions. So Steve, one of the questions was, there seems like there's a lot of Scrum of Scrums meetings. How do you make sure that those are all productive and just don't turn into routine?
Excellent question. One of the lessons that I learned, and one of the bad things that I did, was I tried to have a Scrum of Scrums with too many folks. So for example, we had we had 2 teams that were working on product A, and we had 5 teams working on product B. And so what I decided in the great wisdom of this is I just wanted to have one Scrum of Scrums meeting. So I had all 7 together. Well, what I found is that when product A was talking, everybody who was related to product B, they did not care. Same thing with when the folks on product B were talking, the product A folks, they could care less. And what it turned into was a status report, and people just didn't really care. And it just went down into a flaming mess. And so the biggest thing is that when you create your Scrum of Scrums, it's not that you have to have all the teams there together at once. You need to combine like teams working on a like product where there's a reason why they should get together. Now, when I've got high-performing teams, I tend to, instead of doing a daily Scrum of Scrums, I sometimes go to 3 times a week. If we don't need it every day, and we've got folks that have a maturity that when you've got a person from team 1 that has a dependency issue risk with team 2, over time, the higher performing teams, they're just going to go. You know what, I've got an issue. Let's just go over there and let's just resolve it. I tend to use the Scrum of Scrums as a last responsible moment to actually get something resolved when we actually need to get together. So that's what I do.
Thanks, Steve. And another question, you mentioned there were drawbacks of each of the scaling frameworks. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. What I find with the Scrum at Scale model is that because you can start anywhere, there's not a roadmap, and you have to figure it out. It takes a higher degree of dedication and a little bit more of the willingness to experiment and create a learning organization than some organizations are able to handle. And so when you've got folks that try to adopt Scrum at scale, but they just want a recipe, this may or may not work for them so well. When you take a look at SAFe, I think SAFe is a brilliant model. It has a lot of things that are defined. It's very clear. SAFe also works for approaches beyond Scrum. SAFe can also incorporate Kanban. For example. However, in my personal opinion, in my experience with SAFe, it introduced a lot of bureaucracy that tended to start to hinder organizations once they hit that 30, 40, 50% adoption rate across the company, where it really slowed them down. So for me, I'm not sure if that's quite been figured out just quite yet. And then lastly, with the less approach, I think it works well if you've got small numbers of teams. And I think when you go into the less documentation, I think they say, optimally, 3 to 7 teams, 3 to 9 teams. I think it's in that ballpark. What I find a challenge with that model is that you've got one product owner that works across everybody. And I think you don't get as much visibility and capability to focus on maximizing value and having time to actually spend with your customer, because you're just going to have that one PO work across so many different teams. I think that person turns more into a user story writer as opposed to validated learning and making sure that we're getting the most value out of our backlog.
Thanks, Steve. And another question, where do most organizations struggle with Scrum at Scale most?
I think Scrum at Scale, because it fundamentally changes your organization. I think folks, when they start doing this, say, oh, it's just something that the teams are going to do. But if I were to kind of float back to this diagram here, you'll notice that when you look at this diagram, you're going to be impacting the entire organization, including the culture of the organization. And so you're going to have to understand that when you go through a transformation, that you're going to change from the status quo. And what made you successful in the past may or may not make you successful in the future. And so by having an executive action team in combination with an agile practice, you're going to hit all layers of an organization. And you're going to hit broadly across the organization. And that's where we see a lot of the resistance come through. And so changing things while you're starting to, changing things while you're trying to keep things going in motion, that's a very challenging balance. And I find that when people tend to get into those stressful situations, especially with that demanding client, just get my stuff done, you fall back on what you did before. And the reversion potential without a strong executive action team is pretty high. And so you have to keep moving forward, and that takes that discipline and that commitment to the vision, and the understanding of what you're doing now is not going to help you in the future, especially if you revert back now. That's really the tough thing with Scrum at Scale.
Okay, I think there are no more questions in the question box. So anything else from your end, Steve?
No, I've been working with many different models over the last 12 years to help organizations transform. For me, this is the model I resonate with. And so it's a passion of mine to help organizations become successful. And so I think this is a great approach to help organizations truly change and compete in today's market. And with that, I think that would be my final thought for today.
Okay, well, Steve, thank you for your presentation. Everyone else, thank you for attending. If you don't mind, give us some feedback and feel free to follow up if you have any specific questions or need more information about everything. Thank you very much, everyone.